Simplifying radicals, 11.1a. So I'm going to look at the steps here first to simplify radicals. And the example we're going to work with is the square root of 80. It says factor the number underneath the radical sign, if possible, so that one of its factors is the largest possible perfect square factor. So what we're going to focus in on right now is factoring. So we need to come up with all of the factors of 80. So 1 times 80 is 80. 2 times 40 is 80. 4 times 20 is 80. And I continue on and I say, okay, I also know that 5 times 16 is 80. From there, I would say 8 times 10 is 80. And in that list, I need to pick out the largest perfect square factor. So as I'm looking through, I see 4 is a perfect square, but I also see that 16 is a perfect square. I've got to pick the one that is the largest perfect square pair. So I'm going to work with that 5 times 16, because 16 is larger than 4. So it says you are allowed to split up a radical sign if there is a multiplication underneath it. So I'm going to make the square root of 80, I'm going to make it into the square root of 16 times the square root of 5, because 16 times 5 is 80. Looks different, but it's still equal. And now the square root of 16, you know, is 4. But we don't have a square root of 5, so now it says, I kind of got ahead of myself here. Now the next step says, evaluate the square root of the perfect square and leave the other factor underneath, meaning leave it alone. So what I had started to do was, I said, the square root of 16 is 4. 5 is not a perfect square, so I leave it alone. So my final answer is 4 times the square root of 5, or I could just write 4 square roots of 5. So let's practice with some of these. Square root of 200. So I think about my factors of 200. And I'm going to stop right there at 2 times 100 because I recognize that 100 is going to be my largest perfect square. So I can rewrite the square root of 200 as the square root of 100 times the square root of 2. And I know that the square root of 100 is 10. So that's my perfect square, 10. 2 is not a perfect square. So I've just simplified the square root of 200 to 10 square roots of 2. Let's do the same thing with 32. I start out with my factors that multiply to 32. 2 and 16. I can also go to 4 times 8, and that ends up being it. And I see I have 2 perfect squares, but 16 is a larger perfect square than 4 is, so I'm going to go with the factors of 2 and 16. So I'm going to say that the square root of 32 is equal to the square root of 16 times the square root of 2. The square root of 16 is 4, so my final answer is going to be 4 square roots of 2. Now 17, I think of my factors as 17, and there's only one set of factors, 1 and 17. 1 is a perfect square, but it's not going to do anything for us. Because if I wrote the square root of 17 equals the square root of 1 times the square root of 17, that would be, we know that this is 1, that's just 1 square root of 17. That hasn't changed anything. So the square root of 17 is in simplest radical form. We can't do anything else to it. It's simplified. So what about the square root of 81? Hopefully something just went off in your head and said, oh, the square root of 81, that's perfect. 9. Square root of 81 is a perfect square. Done. 9. 52, I got to go back and I got to think about all the numbers that multiply to 52. 4 and 13. And I'm going to stop right there because I see a perfect square. So the square root of 52 is equal to the square root of 4 times the square root of 13. The square root of 4 is perfect, 2. So I'm left with 2 square roots of 13. 13 is not perfect, leave it alone. 25 gets a little bit interesting because we've got a 5 there, but I've still got to think about my factors of 24. And I start listing them out until I see a perfect square. And I notice that 4 is a perfect square. So the way I'm going to rewrite this one, I can't forget about that 5 that's outside, but I'm rewriting my square root of 24 is the square root of 4 times the square root of 6. So the square root of 4, you know, is 2. Well, what's going on between that 5 and that 2? It's all multiplication. So I'm down to 5 times 2 times the square root of 6. So what is 5 times 2? That's 10. And leave the square root of 6 alone. I can't simplify it anymore. 26, I've got the square root of 20 all divided by 2. So I've got to take care of that square root of 20. I start thinking about my factors of 20, and I find a 4. So I'm going to rewrite the square root of 20 as the square root of 4 times the square root of 5, and it's all being divided by that 2 on the bottom. You know that the square root of 4 is 2. So I'm going to rewrite 2. We leave the square root of 5 alone. I can't do anything with it. Divided by that 2, and now I've got a fraction that I can simplify. 2 divided by 2 is just 1, but my answer is not just 1, my answer is 1 square roots of 5. 1 square root of 5, or you can just say square root of 5. We're not going to do 27 and 28. Keep practicing your factors, and I would keep practicing your perfect squares.